The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the marble-floored hallway as Emily Thompson followed the butler deeper into the mansion. She clutched her worn leather bag, her heart racing with a mix of nerves and hope. It had been a grueling few months, juggling hospital shifts and taking care of her younger brother. This job, being a nanny to the children of one of New York's wealthiest men, could be the lifeline she desperately needed. "Mr. Worthington will see you now," the butler announced, holding the door open. Emily stepped into the grand study, her eyes momentarily caught by the impressive view of Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She quickly composed herself, shifting her gaze to the man seated behind the mahogany desk. James Worthington barely looked up from his stack of papers. He exuded the kind of quiet power that could make a person feel insignificant with just a glance. "Miss Thompson, right?" His voice was deep, calculated, devoid of any warmth. "Yes, sir," Emily replied, feeling the weight of his gaze as he finally looked up. His eyes were cold, almost clinical, as they assessed her. She felt like she was being measured and found lacking. "I've reviewed your credentials," he said, his tone brisk. "You're overqualified for this position. Why would a registered nurse be interested in taking care of 2 children?" Emily hesitated. She could feel the urge to justify herself, to explain the desperate circumstances that led her here, but she knew he wouldn't care. "I enjoy working with children," she said simply, "and I need a more stable schedule." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, though his expression remained impassive. "Very well. My children are 5. Twins. They've been through a lot, and I need someone who can handle their challenges." The way he said it made Emily's stomach twist. What challenges? But before she could ask, the door burst open, and 2 small figures tumbled into the room, giggling and chasing each other. "Liam. Lily." James's voice was sharp, cutting through the children's laughter. They froze, wide-eyed, and looked up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I told you to wait in the playroom," he said, his tone stern. Emily's heart clenched at the sudden shift in his demeanor. The twins glanced at her curiously, their playful energy subdued. "It's okay," Emily interjected gently, crouching down to their level. "You must be Liam and Lily." She smiled, trying to ease the tension. "I'm Emily. I'm going to be spending some time with you." Liam, the braver of the 2, stepped forward. "Do you like dinosaurs?" he asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "I love them," Emily said with a grin. "What's your favorite?" "Velociraptor," he shouted, his enthusiasm infectious. Lily edged closer, still holding her brother's hand tightly. "Mine's the Triceratops," she whispered shyly. James watched the interaction, his expression inscrutable. He seemed almost surprised. Emily stood up, meeting his gaze with a steady confidence she didn't quite feel. "I'd like to start as soon as possible, if that's all right." For a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes, but then he nodded curtly. "You start tomorrow." That night, Emily lay awake in the small apartment she shared with her brother, staring at the cracked ceiling. She was relieved to have gotten the job, but there was something unsettling about James Worthington. His sternness, his distance from his own children. It was like he was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. And then there was the question of his late wife, the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death that were still whispered about in hushed tones. She turned over, trying to push the thoughts away. She had to focus on making a good impression, on helping the twins. Whatever ghosts haunted this family were none of her concern. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about those children, something about the sorrow in their eyes that pulled at her heart. She had seen it before, people hiding pain beneath a veneer of strength. And somehow, she felt that coming here was not just about a job. It was about finding answers, even to questions she hadn't known she needed to ask. As she drifted off to sleep, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The Worthington mansion was quieter than usual as Emily started her first official day. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before pushing open the door to the playroom. The twins were sitting on the floor, surrounded by a chaotic array of toys. Liam was engrossed in building a complicated tower of blocks, while Lily was drawing with crayons, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Good morning," Emily said softly, stepping inside. Both children looked up, their faces lighting up with shy smiles. She felt a surge of warmth at their reaction. Despite their father's aloofness, these children were still just that, children. "I thought we could go outside today," Emily suggested. "There's a garden at the back with a little pond. Would you like that?" Lily's eyes widened. "Really? We never go outside," she murmured, almost as if afraid the suggestion would be taken back. "Why not?" Emily asked gently, but Lily just shrugged, her small shoulders lifting as if it was a question she couldn't answer. Emily decided not to push. "Well, how about we change that today?" As they made their way to the garden, Emily couldn't help but notice the grandeur of the house, its opulence a stark contrast to the modest home she had grown up in. But there were small signs of neglect too, dusty corners, slightly faded curtains, that hinted at a household where joy had long since faded. Outside, the garden was overgrown but beautiful, with vibrant flowers blooming wildly, as if defying the gloom that seemed to shroud the house. The twins ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. For a moment, Emily simply watched them, feeling a strange sense of peace. "Be careful near the pond," she called out, but her voice was light, filled with a happiness she hadn't expected to find here. As the children played, Emily's gaze wandered, eventually landing on a small, weathered bench nestled under an ancient oak tree. Something about the spot drew her in, a pull she couldn't quite explain. She walked over, brushing her fingers over the back of the bench. A forgotten book lay there, its cover worn and edges frayed. Emily picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized it. The Secret Garden, a story she had read countless times with her best friend, Sarah. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cover, her eyes scanning the inscription. "To my dearest Sarah, may your life always be as magical as the gardens we used to dream about. With all my love, James." Emily's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. But as she traced the familiar handwriting, memories she had buried long ago came rushing back. Sarah was James's wife. They had met in college, becoming inseparable, until Sarah's whirlwind romance had taken her away to a life Emily could only imagine. The last time they had spoken, Sarah had been excited about something. A project, she had called it, something that would change everything. And then she had disappeared. The official story was an accident, but Emily had never believed it. The Sarah she knew wouldn't have vanished so easily. She snapped the book shut, a cold dread settling over her. Why was this here, left out like this? It felt almost like a message, a sign. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the garden was empty, save for the distant sounds of the twins' laughter. "Emily, look!" Liam's shout broke her thoughts. He came running over, Lily close behind, holding out a small frog they had caught near the pond. Emily forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease. "That's a very nice frog, Liam," she said, crouching down to get a closer look. "Maybe we should let him go back to his family?" The children reluctantly agreed, releasing the frog back into the water. But Emily's mind was racing. What had Sarah been working on? And why had she kept it a secret, even from James? The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that whatever Sarah had discovered, it was dangerous. And somehow, it was connected to this house, to the cold man who lived here with his two lost children. Emily took a deep breath, pushing down the fear and confusion. She had to keep herself together, at least for the twins. Whatever had happened to Sarah, whatever secrets this family was hiding, she would find out. Not just for herself, but for those two innocent children who deserved so much more than the hollow life they were trapped in. The rest of the day passed in a blur. James was absent, locked away in his office or perhaps out, attending to business. Emily didn't see him, but his presence was a constant weight in the house. She could feel it in the stiffness of the staff, in the way the children quieted whenever his name was mentioned. That evening, after putting the twins to bed, Emily lingered in the hallway outside their rooms. She could hear the soft murmur of their voices, the twins whispering to each other in the dark. They were so young, too young to be carrying the shadows of a mother they barely remembered and a father who was more a ghost than a man. She turned away, her hand slipping into her pocket where the book still rested, the feel of it grounding her. She couldn't leave them. Not yet. There was something here, something she needed to understand, and maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to help them heal, to bring some light back into their lives. As she made her way downstairs, she saw a light on in the study. James, of course, working late. Emily hesitated, then forced herself to keep walking. Tomorrow. She would start asking questions tomorrow. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, the study door creaked open. James stepped out, his expression dark and unreadable. He saw her and paused, a frown creasing his brow. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice tight. "A word, if you have a moment." Emily's heart jumped, but she nodded, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Of course, Mr. Worthington." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the study. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn, and the air was thick with the scent of whiskey. As she took a seat, she saw the book he held, a different one this time, but the sight of it made her chest tighten. "I found this in the garden today," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "It belonged to Sarah." Emily's mouth went dry. She glanced at the book in her own hand, then back at him. His eyes were cold, but there was something else there too. Pain, confusion, maybe even fear. "I need to know, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "How did you know my wife?" Emily felt as if the room had shrunk around her. James's piercing gaze was locked onto her, and the intensity of his question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Her mind raced. She had been careful not to reveal too much, but now, confronted like this, she had no choice but to tread carefully. "We were friends," she began, her voice steady, though she felt anything but calm. "We met in college. Sarah and I. We were close." James's eyes narrowed, his grip on the book tightening. "Friends?" He sounded almost disbelieving, as if the concept itself was foreign to him. "Yes," Emily said softly. "She was more like a sister to me." She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah and I shared everything back then. I knew about her dreams, her fears, the things she wanted from life." There was a flicker of something in James's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "She never mentioned you," he said, almost to himself. Emily hesitated. Of course, she hadn't been mentioned. When Sarah had married James and moved into this world of luxury and isolation, she had distanced herself from everyone, including Emily. But not before she had confided in her about something that still haunted Emily to this day. "There were things Sarah didn't talk about with anyone," Emily said carefully. "Not even you." James's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening. "What are you implying?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Emily felt a pang of fear, but pushed it aside. "I'm not implying anything. There were things she was worried about. She mentioned that she was investigating something. I don't know what it was, but she was scared." James's face darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out. But then he turned away, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of her words had physically struck him. "Sarah wasn't scared of anything," he muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself. "She was strong, fearless. Whatever she was dealing with, she could handle it." Emily swallowed hard. Sometimes, even the strongest people need help. He spun back around, his eyes flashing. "Help? Is that what you think you're here to do? Help?" His voice was bitter, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Anger, frustration, guilt? "I'm here for the children," she said firmly, refusing to back down. "But if there's something I can do to help you understand what happened to Sarah, I will." For a moment, they stood there, the silence between them thick and charged. Then James let out a harsh laugh, the sound filled with a bitterness that cut through the quiet. "Understand? There's nothing to understand. My wife died in an accident. That's all there is to it." "Is it?" Emily asked quietly. The question lingered in the air, heavy and accusing. James's expression shifted, his defenses cracking just a little. "What do you know?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper now. Emily took a step closer, feeling the gravity of the moment. "I know she was afraid of something she thought was dangerous. And I know she was right." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decipher a code. "What are you saying?" Emily hesitated. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and anticipating ever since she had set foot in this house. "Sarah didn't just die, James. She was murdered." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then James stepped back as if he'd been struck, his face pale. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not true." "It is," Emily insisted, her voice urgent. "I didn't want to believe it either, but the signs were there. She left me a message just before she disappeared. She said if anything happened to her, it wasn't an accident." James turned away, his back to her, his hands gripping the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Emily moved closer, her heart aching for the man in front of her. He looked so lost, so utterly broken. "James, I'm not lying. Sarah knew she was in danger. She tried to protect you and the children. But whatever she found out, it was big enough to get her killed." He spun around, his eyes blazing with anger and something else, fear. "Then why the hell didn't you say anything before? Why did you come here?" "Because I didn't know what to do." Emily's voice cracked with emotion. "I was scared, and I was grieving. I didn't know who I could trust. But then I saw the children, and I realized they're still in danger. Whatever Sarah was trying to expose, it's still out there." James's face was a mask of pain, and Emily could see the war raging inside him. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "If what you're saying is true, then, God, I don't even know where to start." Emily reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "We start by finding out what Sarah knew. She must have left something behind, some kind of clue." James stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and a desperate hope. Then he nodded, his jaw set with determination. "All right," he said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Let's find out what really happened." As they stood there, a fragile alliance forming between them, Emily felt a surge of resolve. For too long, she had been haunted by the unanswered questions surrounding Sarah's death. Now, she had a chance to get the answers she had been searching for, and maybe, just maybe, she could help this fractured family heal in the process. Outside, the night was settling in, the house bathed in shadows. But for the first time in years, Emily felt a glimmer of hope, like a tiny flame flickering in the darkness. Together, they were going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The air in the study felt heavy, charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. James stood by the window, staring out into the darkened garden. His posture was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Emily remained seated, watching him, her mind racing with the enormity of what they were about to face. "I need to know everything," James said finally, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Everything she told you." Emily nodded, swallowing the knot of anxiety that had formed in her throat. "It started a few months before she disappeared," she began. "Sarah called me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in a while, and she sounded different, nervous. She told me she was looking into something, but she wouldn't say what, just that it was dangerous." James turned, his eyes searching hers. "Did she mention anyone? Give you any names?" "No," Emily replied, shaking her head, "but she was worried about someone close to you. She didn't trust them, and she thought they were hiding something." James's jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "She never said. She only told me to be careful and that she would contact me again once she had more information." James let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. "And she never did." Emily hesitated. "Actually, she did. The night she disappeared, she left me a voicemail. She sounded terrified, said she had found proof and that she was coming to see me, but she never showed up." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. James's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "And you still have this voicemail?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I did," Emily said, her own voice shaking. "But when I went to listen to it again, it was gone. Deleted." James stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and horror. "Deleted?" By who? I don't know, Emily said, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. But whoever did it knew what they were doing. They wiped everything, her messages, our call history, even my contacts. James looked like he was struggling to keep his composure. Why didn't you go to the police? I did, Emily cried. But without any proof, without any connection to her death, they said it was just a glitch or that I deleted it by mistake. I tried to tell them, but no one believed me. His face contorted with pain, James turned away, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything was crushing him. I should have known, he murmured, almost to himself. I should have seen that something was wrong. Emily rose, moving closer to him, her voice gentle. James, you couldn't have known. Sarah was trying to protect you and the kids. She didn't want you involved. He shook his head, his voice raw. But I am involved, Emily. I was involved from the start. And now I don't even know who to trust. The vulnerability in his voice struck her like a blow. For a moment, all she wanted to do was reach out, to comfort him, to somehow make this right. But there was no way to fix what had been broken. The only thing they could do was find the truth. There must be something she left behind, Emily said, her voice steadying. Something she found. We need to search her things, her office, anywhere she might have hidden it. James nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. I'll start in her study. She spent hours there, working on God knows what. If there's anything to find, it'll be there. Emily followed him as he strode down the hallway, her heart pounding. The house felt different now, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards filled with new meaning. They were no longer just relics of a life that had ended too soon. They were clues, pieces of a puzzle she had never imagined she would be a part of. The study was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight. James moved to the desk, opening drawers and rifling through papers with a controlled urgency. Emily watched him, her eyes scanning the shelves, the photographs on the walls. There was something here, she was sure of it. Anything? She asked after a few minutes, her voice hushed. Nothing, James muttered, his frustration mounting. Just old bills, contracts. Nothing personal. Emily's gaze shifted to a bookshelf in the corner, its top shelf cluttered with knickknacks and framed photos. One of the pictures caught her eye, a candid shot of Sarah, laughing, holding a small child in her arms. Emily stepped closer, her breath catching as she realized the child was Lily, barely a year old. James, look at this, she said, picking up the frame. It's Sarah with Lily. She looks so happy. James glanced over, his face softening for a moment before his eyes darkened. She loved them so much, he said quietly, and I wasn't there. I was always working, always away. I thought I was providing for them, but I was just absent. Emily's heart ached for him, for the pain he was carrying. You did what you thought was best, she said softly, but now we have a chance to do something for her, to find out what happened and make it right. He nodded, his expression resolute. You're right. We have to keep looking. As they continued to search, the minutes stretched into hours. Emily's hands were trembling as she went through the last of the desk drawers, finding nothing but empty notebooks and pens. She was beginning to lose hope when her fingers brushed against something unusual, a small key hidden in the back of the drawer. James, she called out, holding up the key. Look at this. Do you know what it's for? He took the key, turning it over in his hand. I've never seen it before, he said, frowning, but there's a safe in our bedroom. Sarah used to keep personal things there. I thought it was empty, but they exchanged a look, a surge of adrenaline sparking between them. Without another word, they headed upstairs, their footsteps echoing in the silent house. The bedroom was cold, the air thick with memories. Emily watched as James crossed to the walk-in closet, kneeling in front of a small, concealed door in the wall. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the safe door swung open. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn and creased. James reached for it with shaking hands, his breath catching as he flipped it open. The pages were filled with Sarah's neat handwriting, her words spilling out in a chaotic jumble of fear and urgency. Emily leaned in, reading over his shoulder as he turned the pages. It was all there. Names, dates, connections, a tangled web of secrets that painted a picture of a conspiracy far darker than either of them had imagined. "My God," James whispered, his face pale as he stared at the words. She was right. She was right about everything. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she read the final entry. "They're watching me," Sarah had written, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "I don't know how much time I have left. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Tell James the first love him. Tell him I'm sorry." James's hand tightened on the journal, his knuckles white. "Emily, we have to take this to the police." She nodded, her heart pounding. "We will. But we need to be careful. If they find out what we know." He looked at her, his eyes filled with determination and something else, fear. "I'll protect you," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Whatever it takes, I won't let them hurt you." Emily felt a surge of emotion, her throat tightening. "We'll protect each other," she whispered. "For Sarah. For the kids. We'll find out who did this." James nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Together," he said, the word a promise, a vow. As they stood there, side by side, the journal between them, Emily knew they were crossing a line. There would be no going back. But whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The night seemed endless as Emily and James pored over Sarah's journal, their minds racing to piece together the fragments of a story that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the rustle of pages and the occasional murmured question. Outside, the world slept, but inside, they were wide awake, caught in a web of fear and determination. "We need to start at the beginning," James said, his voice steady but strained. He turned back to the first page of the journal, where Sarah had written, in a shaky hand, "I can't trust anyone." Emily's eyes scanned the entry, her heart aching as she read the words. "She was so scared," she whispered. "It must have been horrible, feeling like she couldn't turn to anyone." James nodded, his expression pained. "I thought I was protecting her by keeping my distance, by not asking too many questions. But I was just leaving her alone to deal with this." "You couldn't have known," Emily said gently. "Sarah didn't want to burden you. She was trying to protect you and the kids." He looked at her, his eyes dark with guilt. "And now she's gone. I failed her, Emily." "No," she said firmly, reaching out to touch his arm. "You didn't fail her, and we're going to find out what happened. We owe her that." James took a deep breath, his gaze returning to the journal. "There are names here, but they're just initials. LW, DB, MC. Who are these people?" Emily frowned, her mind racing. They must be connected to whatever she was investigating. She wrote down addresses too. "We should start there." James nodded. "We'll go through each one. Someone must know something." They worked late into the night, creating a plan, listing questions, and deciding their next steps. By the time they finally closed the journal, dawn was breaking, a pale light filtering through the curtains. "Get some rest," James said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We'll need to be sharp for this." Emily hesitated, looking at him with concern. "You should sleep too. You're no good to anyone like this." "I will," he promised. But there was a distant look in his eyes, a haunted expression that told her sleep was the last thing on his mind. Emily nodded, knowing it was pointless to argue. She turned and left the room, her heart heavy. As she climbed the stairs to her own bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time, that the answers they sought were slipping further away with each passing moment. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of fear and uncertainty that loomed over them. Emily and James met in the kitchen, their faces drawn but determined. The twins were already awake, chattering excitedly about something, their voices a welcome burst of normalcy in the tense atmosphere. "Emily, can we go to the park today?" Lily asked, her eyes bright with hope. "Yeah, we never get to go." Liam chimed in, his face glowing with excitement. Emily hesitated, glancing at James. They had so much to do, so many places to visit, but the kids, they deserved a moment of happiness, of normal childhood. James seemed to read her thoughts. "Maybe later, guys," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Emily, and I have to take care of some things first. The twins' faces fell, and Emily's heart twisted. She crouched down, forcing a smile. I promise we'll go later, okay? Maybe we can even have a picnic? Lily's eyes brightened, and she nodded eagerly. Okay, but you promise? I promise, Emily said, her voice soft. She stood up, her gaze meeting James's. We should get going. He nodded, his expression grim. Let's go. Their first stop was a modest apartment building in Brooklyn. The address, scribbled hastily in Sarah's journal, led them to a small, unassuming door on the second floor. James knocked, his heart pounding. They had no idea what, or who, they would find behind it. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with a sharp, wary gaze. She looked them up and down, her eyes narrowing. Who are you? She demanded, her voice brusque. James Worthington, he said, his voice steady. This is Emily Thompson. We're looking for information about my wife, Sarah. The woman's expression changed, a flicker of recognition and something like fear crossing her face. I don't know anything, she said quickly, starting to close the door. Wait, Emily said, her voice urgent. Please, we just want to talk. We think Sarah was in danger, and we're trying to find out what happened to her. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between them. You're really Sarah's husband? She asked, her tone softer now, almost sympathetic. Yes, James said, his voice breaking slightly. Please, if you know anything, the woman sighed, stepping back to let them in. I was afraid this would happen, she muttered, mostly to herself. Come in, but I don't have much time. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with the smell of old books and something spicy cooking on the stove. The woman led them to a cramped living room, gesturing for them to sit. I'm Lillian, she said, her eyes still cautious. I knew Sarah a little. We met at a community center a few years back. She was looking for information, asking a lot of questions about some powerful people. Who? James asked, leaning forward, his eyes intense. Lillian shook her head. I don't know all their names. Just the initials, LW, DB, MC. She said they were involved in something big, something dangerous. She was scared, but she wouldn't back down. Emily exchanged a look with James. Did she say what they were doing? What she found out? Lillian glanced nervously at the door, then back at them. And your assistant must have forgotten to mention that your wife, Sarah Worthington, was here several times before her accident. Emily felt her blood turn to ice. Caldwell knew. He had known who they were all along. This was a trap. James's voice was cold, controlled. Yes, Sarah was involved in a number of charitable projects. She visited many places. But she was very interested in this place, Caldwell said softly, his gaze turning predatory. Asked a lot of questions. Questions that made people uncomfortable. Emily's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. They needed to get out of there, but she didn't know how. Caldwell was blocking their path, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous intensity. I don't know what you're talking about, James said, his voice steady. But if you're trying to imply something, I'm not implying anything, Mr. Worthington, Caldwell interrupted, his voice smooth as silk. I'm just curious why you're here, pretending to be an investor. You're not looking to invest. You're looking for answers. There it was, the truth laid bare between them. Emily's pulse raced, her mind scrambling for a way out. They had been caught, and now they were cornered, with no idea what this man would do next. James's face was like stone, his eyes locked on Caldwell. You know what happened to Sarah? Caldwell's smile widened. What happened to your wife was a tragedy, a terrible accident. But you're stirring up things that are better left buried, Mr. Worthington. Emily felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. Caldwell's voice was calm, too calm, and there was a glint in his eyes that made her stomach twist with fear. Let me give you some advice, Caldwell continued, his voice low and menacing. Leave. Take your questions and your suspicions and walk away. Because if you don't, you might end up just like your wife. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily's mind was racing, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get out of there. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, caught in Caldwell's gaze. James's voice cut through the silence, cold and defiant. I'm not going anywhere until I know what happened to Sarah. Caldwell's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Then you're making a very dangerous mistake, Mr. Worthington. Before Emily could react, Caldwell turned to the guard at the door, nodding once. Escort our guests out. The guard stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. James glanced at Emily, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We're leaving, he said, his voice steady. They turned, walking back down the hallway with the guard close behind. Emily's heart was pounding, her mind a whirl of fear and anger. They had come so close, so painfully close, and now they were being forced out, empty-handed. As they reached the exit, Emily glanced back, catching Caldwell's eye. His expression was cold, triumphant, and she felt a surge of helpless rage. But she forced herself to keep moving, her hand brushing against James's arm in silent support. Outside, the sky was dark and threatening, a storm brewing on the horizon. They walked in silence to the car, every step feeling like a retreat, like a defeat. When they reached the car, James slammed his hand against the roof, his face twisted with frustration. Damn it, we were so close. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her voice quiet but firm. We're not giving up, James. We'll find another way. He looked at her, his eyes burning with determination. They're hiding something, Emily. Something big, and we're going to find it. She nodded, her heart steadying. Together, as they drove away, the building receding in the rearview mirror, Emily felt a sense of resolve settle over her. They were in dangerous territory now, but they were in it together, and they would find the truth, no matter what it cost. The drive back to Manhattan was tense and silent. The threat from Caldwell echoed in their minds, and the reality of what they were up against began to settle in. Emily glanced at James, his jaw set and eyes fixed on the road ahead, but she could see the strain in his expression. The frustration of being so close yet so far from the truth was eating at him. We need to be careful, Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. If they know we're investigating, they'll be watching us. James nodded, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. I know, but we can't stop now. Sarah's journal, everything she found, it's all pointing to something much bigger than we thought. Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing with everything they'd learned. We need to be smart about this. We can't go barging into places like that again. We need a plan. I agree, James said, his voice low and tense, but we're running out of time. Caldwell won't just let this go. They pulled into the parking garage of James's penthouse, the concrete walls cold and unwelcoming. As they stepped out of the car, Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, a sensation she couldn't shake. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence of the empty garage. James noticed her unease. What is it? I don't know, she murmured, still looking around. Something doesn't feel right. James's eyes narrowed, and he instinctively placed a hand on her back, guiding her toward the elevator. Let's get upstairs. We'll be safer there. They rode the elevator in silence, the tension between them growing thicker with each passing floor. When the doors finally slid open to James's penthouse, the spacious, elegantly decorated apartment felt like a fortress, a fragile barrier against the storm that was building outside. James set the journal down on the kitchen island, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. We need to figure out our next move, he said, his voice grim. We're not going to get anywhere without more information. Emily nodded, but her thoughts were scattered, her body tense with the lingering sense of being watched. We should go through everything we have again. Maybe there's something we missed, something that can lead us to someone on the inside. James began to spread the pages of Sarah's journal across the counter, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of her. She moved to the window, looking out over the city, the lights glittering like stars against the darkness. And then she saw it, a black car parked across the street, its headlights off, but the silhouette of a figure inside unmistakable. Her heart leapt into her throat. James, she whispered, stepping back from the window. We're being watched. He was at her side in an instant, his gaze following hers. The car was still there, ominous and unmoving, like a predator waiting to pounce. "We need to call the police," Emily said, her voice shaking. "They're not just going to sit there." But James shook his head. "No, they won't do anything without proof. And whoever that is, they're trying to intimidate us. So what do we do?" Emily asked, fear tightening her chest. James's eyes were dark, filled with a fierce determination. "We act like we're not afraid. We keep going, we find more information, and we don't let them scare us into stopping." Emily nodded, though her body was trembling. She didn't know if she could be as brave as he was, but she wasn't about to give up now. Not after everything they had uncovered. They spent the next few hours poring over Sarah's journal, searching for any clue they might have overlooked. As they worked, the tension eased slightly, replaced by a focused urgency. But Emily couldn't forget the car outside, the shadowy figure watching their every move. "Here," James said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He pointed to a passage in the journal, his eyes bright with excitement. "She mentioned someone, an S. She says they're a whistleblower, someone who works for the company but wants to expose what's happening." Emily leaned over, her heart pounding. "Do you think this S is still around? They might have the proof we need." "It's possible," James said, his voice filled with hope. "But Sarah didn't leave a name, just an initial." "We need to find them," Emily said, her voice urgent. "They're the key to all of this." James nodded, but his expression was cautious. "We have to be careful. If Caldwell and his people find out we're looking for this person." His voice trailed off, and Emily felt a surge of fear. They were already in deep, but this would take them even deeper, into the heart of whatever conspiracy Sarah had uncovered. "We can't back down now," Emily said, her voice steady. "We owe it to Sarah, and to the kids." James looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. Fear, determination, something almost like admiration. "You're right. We'll find them." They worked late into the night, compiling a list of employees, former and current, who might fit the profile of S. As the hours passed, exhaustion settled over them like a heavy blanket, but neither of them mentioned sleep. Finally, around 3 a.m., they had a list of names. People who had left the company around the time Sarah started her investigation. Employees who had been transferred or disappeared from public records altogether. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "We'll start contacting them tomorrow," James said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "One of them has to know something." Emily nodded, but as she looked at the list, a sense of unease settled over her. "We need to be careful how we approach them. If Caldwell finds out we're talking to people..." James's jaw tightened. "I know, but we don't have a choice." They were on the edge now, teetering between discovery and disaster. Every step they took brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to the danger that loomed over them. As they prepared to turn in for the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even inside the safety of the penthouse. She glanced at the windows, the shadows outside pressing in, and wondered if they were truly safe anywhere. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think we're doing the right thing?" He looked at her, his eyes softening. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't live with myself if I don't find out what happened to Sarah. I need to know. For her. For the kids." Emily nodded, understanding the pain behind his words. They were both searching for closure, for justice, for the answers that had been denied to them for so long. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we're in this together." James's gaze held hers, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. "Together," he agreed, his voice a solemn promise. They said goodnight, and Emily retreated to her room, her mind still racing with everything they had learned. As she lay in the darkness, she thought of Sarah, her friend, her sister in spirit, who had faced all of this alone, who had died trying to expose the truth. "I won't let you down," she whispered into the silence, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We'll finish what you started." But even as she vowed to see it through, a part of her couldn't shake the fear that they were walking straight into a trap, that the shadows closing in around them were far darker and more dangerous than they could ever imagine. And somewhere, out in the night, a car engine roared to life, headlights flashing as it pulled away from the curb. The game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The sterile hallway felt like a suffocating tunnel as Emily and James moved silently, their footsteps muffled against the cold, tiled floor. The oppressive quiet was broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. Emily's pulse raced, each beat loud in her ears as they navigated the maze-like corridors of the facility, the walls lined with locked doors that hinted at unspeakable secrets hidden within. James led the way, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready. They stopped in front of a door marked with a simple sign, "Authorized personnel only." He glanced back at Emily, his expression grim. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever they were hiding, it's in here." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what they might find on the other side. "Let's do this." James took out the keycard they had found in one of the offices earlier. He slid it through the reader, holding his breath as the small light flashed red, then green. The lock clicked open, and he pushed the door slowly, peering inside. The room beyond was dimly lit, dominated by a large, glass-enclosed chamber in the center. Inside, there were rows of metal gurneys, each one occupied by a figure lying motionless under a white sheet. The sight made Emily's blood run cold. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this place?" James stepped inside, his eyes wide with shock and horror. "It's a morgue," he said, his voice thick. "But why are they here? What happened to them?" They moved closer, and Emily hesitated before pulling back the sheet on the nearest gurney. The body underneath was that of a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, tubes protruding from her arms and neck. Her eyes were closed, and she looked almost peaceful, as if asleep. But the stillness of her chest told a different story. "She's dead," Emily murmured, her heart aching. What did they do to her? James's face was pale, his hands shaking with barely suppressed rage. These people, they were part of the experiments. They must have died from whatever they were testing on them. Emily felt a wave of nausea, but forced herself to focus. "We need proof. Something that shows what they were doing here." They moved around the room, searching through cabinets and drawers. Emily found a stack of files, her eyes scanning the pages filled with clinical jargon and cold, detached descriptions of the experiments conducted on each subject. "This is sick," she whispered, her voice trembling. They were using these people like lab rats, testing drugs, chemicals. Some of this is so dangerous it shouldn't even exist. James's jaw tightened, his voice a low growl. "We have to get this out of here. This is the proof we need." They were gathering the files when a soft click echoed through the room, the sound of a door opening behind them. Emily and James froze, their eyes meeting in silent terror. Slowly, they turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Caldwell. He stood there, his expression a twisted mix of amusement and cold fury. "I knew you couldn't resist," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "You just had to keep digging." James stepped forward, his body tense, ready for a fight. "You're not going to get away with this, Caldwell. We have everything we need to expose you." Caldwell's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Expose me? You're in the middle of nowhere, Mr. Worthington. No one knows you're here. By the time anyone finds you, there will be nothing left to expose." Emily's heart pounded, her mind racing. They were trapped, and Caldwell was right. They were alone, surrounded by his people. She glanced around the room, searching for any way out, any hope of escape. James's voice was calm, but Emily could hear the edge of desperation. "We're leaving, Caldwell. You can't stop us." Caldwell laughed, the sound echoing through the sterile room like a twisted mockery. "Oh, but I can, and I will." He stepped aside, and two armed guards entered, their guns trained on Emily and James. "Drop the files," one of them ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Emily's hands shook as she slowly set the files down, her heart hammering in her chest. They were so close. They couldn't lose everything now. James's eyes were locked on Caldwell, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You're a monster," he spat. "You killed all these people, and for what? Money? Power? Caldwell's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. You have no idea what's at stake here. These experiments, this research, it's worth billions. And you're not going to ruin it. Emily's mind raced. She knew they had to get out, but with the guards' guns pointed at them, there was no way they could fight their way free. They needed a distraction, something to give them a chance. Her eyes flicked to the emergency alarm on the wall, just a few feet away. If she could reach it, she met James's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. He gave the slightest nod, and Emily took a deep breath, her heart racing. Then she moved. She lunged for the alarm, her hand slamming into the button as the guards shouted, their guns swinging towards her. The siren blared to life, a deafening wail that echoed through the building. Chaos erupted. James threw himself at the nearest guard, knocking the gun from his hand. Emily ducked as the other guard fired, the bullet whizzing past her head. She grabbed the stack of files, shoving them into her bag as James wrestled with the guard. Caldwell shouted something, his voice lost in the blaring alarm. Emily didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed James's arm, pulling him towards the door. "Run!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the noise. They sprinted down the hallway, the alarm blaring in their ears. Behind them, Caldwell and the guards gave chase, their shouts echoing through the building. Emily's heart pounded as they rounded a corner, the exit door just ahead. "We're almost there," she gasped, her legs burning with effort. But as they reached the door, a figure stepped into their path. It was another guard, his gun raised, blocking their only escape. "Stop right there," he barked, his eyes cold and unyielding. Emily's heart sank. They were trapped. There was no way out. James's voice was low, filled with a desperation she had never heard before. "Please, we just want to leave. We won't say anything. Just let us go." The guard hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. Then, without warning, a gunshot rang out. The guard stumbled, his eyes wide with shock as he collapsed, clutching his chest. Behind him stood the woman from the park, her hands shaking as she held a smoking gun. "Go!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Get out of here." Emily and James didn't need to be told twice. They bolted through the door, their feet pounding on the gravel as they sprinted towards their car. The alarm was still blaring, the chaos inside the building spilling out into the night. They reached the car, James fumbling with the keys as Emily threw the bag into the back seat. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the tires screeching on the asphalt. As they drove away from the facility, Emily's heart began to slow, the adrenaline fading, leaving her shaking with fear and relief. They had made it. Somehow, they had escaped. James's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his face pale. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Emily nodded, though tears were streaming down her face. "I'm fine. I'm okay." They drove in silence, the night stretching out before them like a dark, endless road. They had the proof they needed, but the cost had been high. People had died, good people, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on Emily like a heavy, suffocating blanket. But they had made it out. They had the files, the evidence that could bring Caldwell and his entire operation down. And for Sarah, for all the people who had suffered and died, that was worth everything. As they reached the edge of the city, Emily glanced at James, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. He looked exhausted, drained, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes that gave her hope. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We got what we needed." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It's not over yet. We still have to make sure this gets out. We still have to finish what Sarah started." Emily reached out, her hand finding his. "We will," she said softly. Together. The city lights loomed closer, a beacon in the darkness. They had survived the night, but the battle was far from over. They would face whatever came next, side by side, and they would see it through to the end. Because now, there was no turning back. The city lights blurred past as James's car sped down the highway, the engine roaring against the silence of the night. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her heart still pounding from the chaos they had left behind. She glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black SUV from before chasing them, but the road behind was mercifully empty. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "We actually did it." James nodded, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "We have the evidence, but we're not safe yet. We need to get out of sight, find somewhere secure to go through everything we found." Emily's mind was racing. The files they had taken held the proof they needed, but they also painted a chilling picture of the horrors Caldwell and his organization had been conducting. People had been subjected to unthinkable experiments, their lives destroyed in the name of profit and power. She reached into the bag, pulling out the stack of documents, her fingers brushing against the flash drive labeled Project Elysium. "This could change everything," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the small piece of plastic and metal. "If we can get this to the right people." James glanced at her, his expression fierce. "We will. But we need to be careful. Caldwell won't stop until he's silenced us." Emily nodded, her throat tightening at the thought. She knew he was right. They had barely escaped with their lives, and the shadow of Caldwell's influence loomed large over them. They couldn't trust anyone, not even the authorities, not until they had solid, indisputable proof. "We need a plan," she said, her voice steadier now. "Somewhere to lay low, where we can go through all of this without being found." James was silent for a moment, his mind clearly racing through options. Then he nodded, his eyes narrowing in determination. "I know a place. My family has a cabin upstate, deep in the woods. It's isolated, and there's no cell reception. We'll be off the grid." Emily felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. "Okay," she said, clutching the flash drive tightly. "Let's go." The drive was long, the roads winding and empty as they left the city behind. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable, filled with the shared understanding of what they had just survived and the grim determination of what still lay ahead. As they approached the cabin, nestled in the dense woods far from any main road, Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her. The darkness seemed less oppressive here, the air crisp and clean. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel the fear and adrenaline begin to ebb. James parked the car behind a cluster of trees, out of sight from the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. They gathered their things and made their way to the small wooden structure, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the night. "It's not much," James said as he unlocked the door, his voice low, "but it's safe." Emily stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cabin was simple, a single room with a small kitchen area, a worn couch, and a wooden table. A few framed pictures lined the walls, and there was a faint smell of pine and old books. "It's perfect," she said softly, setting the bag on the table. "We'll be safe here." James nodded, though his eyes were still filled with worry. "Let's go through everything. We need to know exactly what we have." They spent the next few hours sorting through the files, each revelation more horrifying than the last. The experiments Caldwell's company had conducted were beyond cruel, testing experimental drugs on unwilling subjects, falsifying death records, and covering up the disappearances of those who got too close to the truth. Emily felt sick as she read through the documents, her hands trembling. "They didn't care about any of these people," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They just used them, like they were nothing." James's face was grim, his eyes dark with anger. "Sarah knew," he said quietly. "She found out what they were doing and tried to stop them. That's why they killed her." Emily nodded, tears burning in her eyes. She was so brave. She knew the risk, but she didn't back down. James reached out, his hand covering hers. "We won't let her sacrifice be for nothing. We'll make sure the world knows what she did, what she found." They continued to sift through the files, their minds numbed by the sheer scale of the atrocities detailed within. The flash drive, they discovered, held video evidence, recordings of the experiments, the desperate pleas of the victims, the cold, clinical voices of the scientists as they carried out their horrific work. "This is it," James said, his voice low and filled with resolve. "This is the proof we need." But as they sat there, the weight of the evidence before them, A creeping sense of dread settled over Emily. They had the proof, but they were still alone, still vulnerable. And Caldwell would stop at nothing to ensure that proof never saw the light of day. "We need to send this to someone we can trust," Emily said, her voice tight. "Someone who can take this and make it public." James nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Who?" "We don't know who's in Caldwell's pocket. The media, the police, they could all be compromised." Emily's mind raced. There had to be someone, some way to get this out without putting themselves in more danger. Then, suddenly, an idea struck her. "I know a journalist," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Her name's Rebecca Miller. She works for an independent news outlet, one that's not afraid to take on powerful people. I helped her once, a long time ago, with a case at the hospital. She might be willing to help us." James looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Do you trust her?" "I do," Emily said firmly. "If anyone can get this story out, it's Rebecca." James nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we contact her. But we have to be careful. If Caldwell finds out what we're doing, he won't," Emily said, though fear clawed at her stomach. "We'll be smart about it." They spent the next few hours preparing everything: copies of the files, the videos, a detailed account of what they had discovered. Emily drafted a message to Rebecca, outlining the situation as succinctly as she could, without revealing their location. "Are you sure about this?" James asked as she prepared to send the email, using an encrypted account they had set up earlier. Emily took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the send button. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "We have to do this." She clicked send, her heart pounding as the message disappeared from the screen. There was no going back now. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just done settling over them. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if the danger outside had crept closer with each passing second. "What now?" James asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Emily looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and determination. "Now we wait, and we hope." Hours passed, the tension between them a tangible thing. Emily's mind raced with every possible outcome, every way this could go wrong. She tried to stay calm, to focus, but the fear was relentless, gnawing at her insides. And then, just as dawn began to break, her phone buzzed, a single, sharp sound that seemed to echo through the stillness of the cabin. She grabbed it, her hands trembling as she saw the message on the screen. It was from Rebecca. "Got your message. This is huge. We need to meet. Can you get to the city?" Emily's heart leapt into her throat. Rebecca was willing to help, but meeting in the city was a risk, a huge one. James leaned over, reading the message. "It's dangerous," he said, his voice low. "Caldwell's people could be watching." "I know," Emily said, her mind racing, "but we don't have a choice. We have to get this to her." James was silent for a moment, then he nodded, his eyes hard with resolve. "We'll do it, but we have to be careful." They spent the next few hours planning their move, every detail scrutinized and rechecked. Emily's heart was in her throat as they prepared to leave, the fear a constant, suffocating presence. They drove back towards the city, the tension between them palpable. Every car that passed made Emily's pulse spike. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. But there was no turning back now. They arrived at the designated meeting spot, a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emily's eyes scanned the area, her heart pounding as they parked the car and stepped out. Rebecca was already there, sitting at a corner table, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening in recognition and concern. "Emily," she said, her voice hushed but urgent. "James, you two look like you've been through hell." "We have," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly, "and we need your help." Rebecca's eyes softened, but her expression was serious. "I'll do whatever I can, but we need to move fast. If what you sent me is true," "It is," James said, his voice firm, "and Caldwell will do anything to stop us." Rebecca nodded, her eyes scanning the cafe nervously. "Okay, let's go somewhere safer. We can't talk here." They left the cafe, the fear a constant presence as they drove to a more secure location. a small office Rebecca's outlet used for sensitive meetings. The room was stark, a single table and a few chairs, but it felt like a fortress compared to the vulnerability of the cafe. "Show me everything," Rebecca said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to get this out as soon as possible." Emily handed over the files, the flash drive, her heart pounding as Rebecca began to go through them. The journalist's face paled as she read, her eyes widening with each new revelation. It's worse than I imagined," she whispered, her voice filled with horror. "We need to go public with this. Now." "We need to be careful," James cautioned. "If Caldwell finds out we're doing this, he'll—" A sudden noise outside the office made them all freeze, their eyes widening in fear. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she heard the sound of footsteps, then the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "We're not alone," Rebecca whispered, her face pale. James's eyes met Emily's, a fierce determination burning in their depths. "No matter what happens, we have to get this out. The world needs to know." Emily nodded, her fear giving way to a cold, steady resolve. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to back down now. "Then let's do it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Whatever it takes." As the door burst open and armed men flooded into the room, Emily's mind was clear, her heart steady. They would fight, they would run, they would do whatever it took to ensure that Sarah's truth, their truth, saw the light of day. Because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about justice, about hope, about finally ending the darkness that had taken so much from them all. And no matter what, they would not let it win. The armed men stormed into the room, their presence a menacing force that filled the small office with a suffocating tension. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she instinctively moved closer to James, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Beside her, Rebecca stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "Get down!" one of the men barked, his gun trained on them. "Now!" James's gaze flicked to Emily, then to Rebecca. His eyes were filled with a desperate urgency. "Do it," he whispered, "but stay calm." Slowly, they lowered themselves to the ground, their hands raised in surrender. Emily's mind raced, the weight of their situation pressing down on her like a vice. This was it, the end of the line. Caldwell had found them, and now they were trapped. But as she glanced at James, she saw something in his eyes. A spark, a plan forming even in the midst of the chaos. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. One of the men, his face obscured by a black mask, stepped forward, his gun aimed directly at James. "Where's the evidence?" he demanded, his voice harsh and cold. "The files, the drive. Where is it?" James's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on the man. "You'll never get away with this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that Emily knew must be coursing through him. "People will find out. They'll know what you did." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, the barrel of his gun pressing against James's forehead. "I won't ask again." Panic surged through Emily, but she forced herself to stay calm, her mind racing. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be. And then, without warning, James moved. In a blur of motion, he knocked the gun aside, the shot going wide and shattering a window. Chaos erupted as James lunged at the man, his fists swinging. The room exploded into violence, shouts and gunfire filling the air. "Run!" James shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here!" Emily grabbed Rebecca's arm, pulling her towards the door as the men struggled with James. Her heart was pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they stumbled into the hallway. "We can't leave him," Rebecca cried, her face pale with fear. Emily hesitated, her heart wrenching at the thought of leaving James behind. But she knew what he was doing. He was buying them time, giving them a chance to escape. "He'll be okay," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We have to get the evidence out. It's the only way to stop them." They ran down the narrow corridor, the sound of fighting and shouting fading behind them. Emily's mind was a blur of fear and determination. She had to get to safety, had to get this story out, no matter what it took. Bursting through the exit, they found themselves in a dimly lit alley. The night air was cold, biting against their skin as they stumbled forward, their footsteps echoing off the walls. "We need to find help," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "Someone who can get this to the media." Emily nodded, her heart still racing. She glanced at the drive in her hand, the evidence they had risked everything to obtain. It felt like a lifeline, the only hope they had left. They made their way through the city streets, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a potential danger. Emily's thoughts kept drifting back to James, to the fierce determination in his eyes as he told her to run. He had to be okay. He just had to be. As they reached a main road, Emily spotted a police car parked on the corner. Her heart leapt into her throat. This could be their chance, a way to get to safety, to get the evidence into the right hands. "Rebecca, look," she whispered, pointing to the car. "The police." "We can," but Rebecca grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the shadows. "No, we can't trust them. Not yet. We don't know who's on Caldwell's payroll." Emily hesitated, the weight of the drive heavy in her hand. She knew Rebecca was right. They couldn't risk everything now, not when they were so close. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice desperate. Rebecca's eyes were filled with determination. "We get to my editor. She'll know what to do." They continued down the street, their eyes scanning every corner for signs of danger. The fear was a constant presence, a shadow that clung to them as they made their way through the city. Finally, they reached the building where Rebecca's editor worked, a small, unassuming office tucked away on a quiet street. Emily's heart pounded as they approached the door, her mind racing with what they were about to do. Rebecca knocked, her hand trembling slightly. The door opened a moment later, revealing a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Rebecca," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "We need your help and," Rebecca said, her voice urgent. "We have something big, but we're being hunted. We need to get this out now." Anne's eyes widened as she took in their disheveled appearance, the fear in their eyes. "Come inside," she said, stepping aside to let them in. They hurried into the office, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. Emily felt a brief surge of relief, the safety of the enclosed space a stark contrast to the danger outside, and turned to them, her expression serious. "What's going on?" Rebecca quickly explained everything, her words tumbling out in a rush, and listened, her face growing graver with each passing moment. "We have the proof," Emily said, holding up the drive. "Everything Caldwell's been doing, the experiments, the murders, it's all on here." Anne's eyes narrowed as she took the drive, her fingers brushing against Emily's. "This is dangerous. If what you're saying is true." "It is," Rebecca said, her voice firm. "We need to get this out, Anne, before they find us." And nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll do it, but we need to move fast." She led them to a small room in the back of the office, where a row of computers lined the walls. Emily watched as and plugged the drive into one of the machines, her hands moving quickly over the keyboard. Images and documents flashed across the screen. Horrifying glimpses of the experiments, the twisted faces of the victims, the cold, clinical notes of the scientists. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. "It's unbelievable," Anne murmured, her eyes wide. "We need to publish this now." Emily felt a surge of hope. They were so close to exposing the truth. But then, a sudden noise outside the office made her heart stop. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. "They're here," Rebecca whispered, her voice filled with fear. Anne's face tightened. "I'll hold them off. You two, get to the back. There's a fire escape. Go." "But," Emily started to protest, but Anne cut her off, her eyes fierce. "Go. Now." Rebecca grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her towards the back of the office. Emily's heart was pounding, her mind a blur of fear and desperation. They had to get out. They had to survive. As they reached the fire escape, the door burst open behind them, armed men flooding into the office, and stood in their path, her body a barrier between them and the danger. "Go!" she shouted, her voice ringing with defiance. Emily and Rebecca scrambled onto the fire escape, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they climbed down the metal steps. Below them, the alley was dark and empty, the night air cold against their skin. They reached the ground, their feet hitting the pavement with a thud. Emily's heart was racing, her mind filled with the image of and standing alone against the men who had come for them. "We have to keep moving," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "We can't stop." Emily nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But they couldn't stop, not now. They had to get the story out, had to finish what they had started. They ran through the alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The city loomed around them, a dark and twisted maze that seemed to close in on all sides. But Emily's mind was clear, her heart steady. They would get this out. They would see this through. Because this was bigger than them, bigger than their fear or their pain. This was about justice, about truth, about finally ending the darkness that had taken so much from them all. They emerged onto a busy street, the lights and noise a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Emily's breath came in short, sharp gasps as they hailed a cab, the relief of the enclosed space almost overwhelming. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice a gruff bark. "Anywhere," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "Just drive." The cab pulled away from the curb, the city blurring past them as they sped away. Emily's hands were shaking, her heart still pounding in her ears. But as she glanced at Rebecca, she saw the determination in her eyes, the fire that still burned bright despite everything they had been through. "We'll make it," Rebecca said, her voice firm. "We'll get this out. We'll stop them." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. For Sarah, for all of them. They drove through the night, the city lights fading into the distance. The road stretched out before them, a dark and winding path filled with uncertainty and danger. But Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her, a quiet resolve that steadied her heart. They had faced the darkness and survived, and now they would bring that darkness into the light. Because no matter what happened next, they knew they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the truth. And that, in the end, was stronger than any shadow, any fear. They would fight, they would run, they would do whatever it took. Because this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new journey.